Hello, I'm Admiral Bob Papp, United States Coast Guard retired, currently and proudly serving at the United States State Department as the Special Representative for the Arctic. Welcome to the third Sea Level Rise Summit. I didn't even know you had a first and a second, so how pleased am I to find out that you're already on your third. And I love your theme, Connected Futures from Alaska to Florida. Let me begin by saying I'm sorry I'm not able to join you in person. But I want to applaud all of you in attendance for gathering to discuss the very important issue of rising sea levels, a catastrophic effect of climate change that's already impacting regions around the world, including where you're sitting now in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And from where you sit, it's over 4,000 miles to Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost city in the United States, located far north of the Arctic Circle. That's a pretty significant distance, with a lot of Canada in between. But regardless, hard-working scientists have taught us that the effects of climate change impacting the small town of Barrow are strongly connected to the impacts facing cities in Florida, like Miami and Fort Lauderdale. So what exactly is happening in the Arctic? Some would say it's unraveling. Some would say it's in crisis. But the one common theme is that the Arctic is getting warmer. In fact, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. And this is leading to profound changes that threaten communities and ecosystems, not only in this unique region, but all over the world. The Arctic provides vital services for our world. Among others, its snow and ice help bounce heat back into space. The Arctic is basically the Earth's natural air conditioner, and you certainly wouldn't want to find yourself living in a Florida home with a broken air conditioner. But that's where we seem to be headed. The National Snow and Ice Data Center just announced that this year, the maximum sea ice extent covering the Arctic Ocean was smaller than ever. And of course, without sea ice and snow cover, the Arctic loses its ability to reflect sunlight. And that absorbed sunlight further warms the ocean's waters, melting more ice and further warming our planet. Only about 10% of the incoming solar radiation is absorbed by snow and ice. When sea ice melts and ocean waters become visible, that figure rises to 90%, a big increase. Those warmer waters then contribute to sea level rise as a result of the ocean's thermal expansion, to say nothing of what it means for the marine life accustomed to their frigid Arctic environment. Scientists at the Ice Research Center in Copenhagen, Denmark told me last year that most of the sea level rise thus far is from thermal expansion. The worst is yet to come, because sea level rise is not just caused by the thermal expansion of the ocean water, but the melting of ice sheets and land-based glaciers. In the Arctic, this includes the massive Greenland ice sheet and Canadian Alaskan glaciers, most of which are shrinking. It's estimated that complete melting of the Greenland ice sheet would result in 20 feet of global sea level rise, though complete melting would likely take centuries. How long such melting would take depends on how fast and how much the planet warms. I guess that's why some have coined the saying, "Where goes the Arctic, there goes Miami." And it's not just Miami. When you look at the projections on a map, much of our East Coast, including my hometown in Connecticut, is vulnerable to rising seas. Sea level rise isn't the only consequence of rapid sea ice loss. Sea ice is critical for marine ecosystems and for the people living in Alaska, the indigenous and local communities that have depended upon Arctic sea ice for subsistence hunting, for sources of food, and for protection. In Alaska, ice acts as a natural barrier, sheltering the coastline from hostile seas. Without this protection, Alaskan shorelines are now eroding, some retreating tens of feet per year, causing homes to fall into the ocean and forcing age-old communities to relocate. And then there's permafrost, the layer of soil that remains frozen for multiple years. As the permafrost thaws due to warming temperatures, the soil's organic material begins to decompose, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. In fact, the permafrost in the Arctic is estimated to possibly contain twice as much carbon as what's already in the atmosphere. Just think about what this might mean for the planet if any significant portion of this permafrost carbon is released. Not only will the Arctic communities that live in the areas sensitive to permafrost thaw be faced with the difficult and costly need to relocate as their infrastructure collapses, but climate change itself and its negative impacts, like sea level rise, will be further accelerated with the addition of even more carbon in the atmosphere and will negate most of the hard work that we've done trying to curb greenhouse gas emissions. We obviously have identified the problems, and we know that the science behind the climate change in the Arctic, but the question I get asked as a policymaker in Washington is what solutions we're coming up with to mitigate and adapt to these changing conditions. The cornerstone of our work in the Arctic is the Arctic Council itself, the high-level forum in which the 8 Arctic states and the region's indigenous groups discuss circumpolar issues. The United States assumed the chairmanship of the Arctic Council just over 1 year ago, and through our leadership, we're working hard to address the impacts of climate change through several initiatives. The Arctic Council is beginning to take a look at what a 2-degree temperature increase globally could look like for the Arctic so that we can prepare for its impacts. We're also framing our climate discussions around resilience, considering how Arctic communities will respond to the changes rapidly occurring around them. It's essential that we identify, understand, and respond to the climate changes occurring across the region so that we can build resilient communities. Climate change impacts are so acute in the Arctic in part because pollutants like black carbon have significant local effects. As black carbon, which is basically soot, settles on snow and ice, it reduces reflectivity, which in turn speeds melting. For this reason, the United States is now leading an Arctic Council expert group on black carbon, which is also focusing on methane. Every Arctic state and several of the observer nations have recently provided reports on their national black carbon and methane emissions to the Arctic Council Secretariat. Based on that information, the expert group is identifying best practices that can be replicated, helping to slow the pace of warming. When we think of the Arctic energy, oil and gas is often the first thing that comes to mind. But the Arctic is also an area rich in renewable energy resources just waiting to be deployed. Many Arctic communities are heavily reliant on costly diesel generation for home heating, electricity, and transportation. We want to promote increased access to clean energy in Arctic communities. Facilitating broad access to clean energy will reduce pollution, improve human health, and help to relieve families of the heavy financial burden caused by high fuel and home heating expenses. One of my priorities continues to be raising awareness domestically about the Arctic. The United States is an Arctic nation. A year ago, when we began our chairmanship, there seemed to be little consciousness outside of Alaska of the Arctic's impact on our country. We've made some headway in this endeavor, and conferences like this one in Fort Lauderdale help to show the lower 48 that the United States is an Arctic nation, and the fate of the Arctic is the fate of Florida and many other states. We also recently launched a blog called Our Arctic Nation. Each week, the medium features a first-hand account of an American representing a different U.S. state who explains the Arctic's relationship to their community. In the 4 months since the blog's launch, I've read about a lot of interesting states and their connections to the Arctic. But our most significant effort in raising awareness of the Arctic was President Obama's historic visit to Alaska last summer, where he became the first sitting president to visit the U.S. Arctic. The president spent 3 full days in the state, attending the Glacier Conference and visiting those communities on the front lines of climate change. At the White House, there's a sense of urgency now that progress has to be made in advancing our Arctic priorities. A reflection of the president's message from Glacier, where he emphasized that there's such a thing as being too late.
We're making a difference, but we have to keep going. We are not moving fast enough. If we were to abandon our course of action, if we stop trying to build a clean energy economy and reduce carbon pollution, if we do nothing to keep glaciers from melting faster and oceans from rising faster and forests from burning faster and storms from growing stronger, we will condemn our children to a planet beyond their capacity to repair. Submerged countries, abandoned cities, fields no longer growing, indigenous peoples who can't carry out traditions that stretch back millennia, entire industries of people who can't practice their livelihoods, desperate refugees seeking the sanctuary of nations not their own, political disruptions that could trigger multiple conflicts around the globe. That's not a future of strong economic growth. That is not a future where freedom and human rights are on the move. On this issue of all issues, there is such a thing as being too late.
Both within and outside the Arctic Council, we've demonstrated that the Arctic is without a doubt a top priority for our nation. But as a reminder, there will be no little flashing red light indicating an emergency is taking place in the Arctic that requires our immediate action. Climate change-related impacts like sea level rise are oftentimes gradual, such as when nuisance flooding in South Beach becomes slightly more frequent. And in some cases, we don't feel the impacts until a hurricane arrives, bringing with it a record-breaking storm surge. That was something I witnessed as Commandant of the Coast Guard during Superstorm Sandy, when records were set at Battery Park in New York, and some of our Coast Guard facilities were damaged along the East Coast. These impacts will only get worse with rising seas. The time to act is now. Preparing the Arctic's future will require careful strategic planning and a shared commitment to peaceful international cooperation so that the vitality of this important region will endure for generations. The United States is committed to working with our Arctic partners to guarantee that this special region is prepared for the opportunities and challenges before it. Together, we're moving in the right direction, and thanks to people like you and the discussions you'll be having today, we just might be able to stem this rising tide. Thank you again for allowing me to speak with you today, and enjoy the rest of your conference.